Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's current affairs programme. My name is Emma Webb and I am joined this week by the director of the New Culture Forum, Peter Whittle, and Caroline Ffiske from Conservatives for Women. This week in the news we've seen the victory of Orban in Hungary, as well as the latest news surrounding women's rights and what has been hailed as a new suffragette movement. So if we could begin by kicking off by talking about the campaign that you're involved with, Caroline, would you be able to give us an update on exactly what that campaign is about and what your objectives are?
Okay, so I'm Caroline Ffiske from Conservatives for Women, and the reason we formed was we became more and more aware of how gender ideology, which is about preferencing the idea of sort of an inner gender identity over sex, how that was more and more being preferenced in law and legislation and spaces. So, for example, that trans-identifying males, should they be allowed into women's spaces? Should they be allowed into women's sports? Should they be allowed into NHS hospital wards? And so much of this was actually happening, and the government seemed to be behind it, the Labour Party getting behind it, politicians becoming fearful of even actually saying what a woman is. So Conservatives for Women formed to challenge this, to say that biological sex is real, that science is real, that we must pursue truth, and we need open debate about this issue and its policy implications. So Conservatives for Women formed, and then we teamed up with women from other parties to form Women Uniting. And as the local elections are coming up, we thought this is the ideal time to really take this out to the public. So we joined up with the Women's Rights Network, which is grassroots women who are very concerned about this issue, and with Sex Matters, which is Maya Forstater's group.
Oh, Maya Forstater, yeah.
Okay, so Maya lost her job because she was tweeting about this issue. Yeah. And she effectively was tweeting about the idea that sex matters and that sex is real, and that women are adult human females, and she lost her job. So she's gone on to found Sex Matters. Mm-hmm. And the three groups have come together, really ideal grouping, and are taking it out to the wider public now and are saying, with the run-up to the local elections, we want to challenge all candidates and all campaigners and all the political parties to say, where do you stand on this issue, and will you protect women's single-sex spaces, women's sports and women's rights?
I've seen in the paper, you've had a lot of coverage this week, but there are three of you, aren't there? So one of those be Maya Forstater, and who's the other?
Okay, so Heather Binning founded the Women's Rights Network. Yeah. And so what that is, you can just imagine women getting so frustrated as, so many things happen, like they're watching on the television about, men competing in women's sports and at the highest level at the Olympics. So women found each other via social media, Mumsnet, Twitter, and sort of said, well, what can we all do? I mean, we've really got to defend our rights, and we've got to defend science and the truth. So they actually formed grassroots groupings, and Heather really helped to bring them all together and to introduce women to each other so we can talk and say, what can we do? So that's a really amazing grassroots movement. And men and women from all over the country can join that. So it's an amazing threesome because we've got that grassroots of anyone who's interested in this issue can join in. Then we've got women who have associated themselves with political parties, and we're really clear that we want all parties to address this. Some people have said to us, well, will you go off and found a new party? We're saying absolutely not. Science is real. The sexes are real. So we want all the political parties to engage in this, and that's why we've united. And then you've obviously got Sex Matters, which is becoming a little bit like a think tank, really focusing on policy and really focusing on, facing into government and saying we need to talk about these matters. So it's an ideal grouping across the three groups.
By way of explaining to our audience why this is necessary, I know that obviously in the last couple of weeks there have been a lot of news stories surrounding sex-based rights and gender, and particularly Labour Party politicians, but across the board, politicians being very frightened of answering the question, what is a woman? So would you be able to give our audience sort of a better understanding of the context from which this campaign is emerging and why it's necessary?
Gosh,
it's a big question.
Okay, so one of the difficult things about this is it's become so big. So the NHS has stopped really defending single-sex wards. The NHS has stopped defending single-sex services. So if a woman, she's going in for an intimate service, and maybe she's a Muslim, she's Jewish, she's Christian, and she says, I just want you to be absolutely clear that the doctor or the nurse will be female. Now, the NHS has kind of backed away of, really understanding her question for, how we all understand that question. Yeah. So that's the NHS. Prisons. Probably lots of people in this country don't realise that men are now in women's prisons if they identify as female. Most of them will physically, they won't have undergone any surgery or anything. And so they're in prison. They might be violent offenders, but they're in women's prisons. And we're saying that that's just wrong. So it's right across our sort of public services that women's single-sex spaces are under attack. And then, it's going all the way up through language being under attack. So probably lots of people listening have heard that politicians have become afraid to answer a straight question, what is a woman?
Right across the board, I'd say, because Rishi Sunak
Yep.
also didn't he? On that National Health Service point, there was a terrible case. I mean, actually, it was a really upsetting case where a woman said she'd been raped. And they effectively, in this kind of Orwellian way, said you couldn't have been raped because there are no men on the ward. Well, there was a trans woman on the ward. And they've now admitted that, in fact, he was there and there was the rape occurred. But the thing is that that's a fantastic example, isn't it, of ideology trumping safety. And the NHS.
Absolutely. So ideology has been trumpeting safety. So that's, again, prison or hospital wards, as you said, but prisons. But actually on safety, sports. It's not safe for bigger, stronger men to be competing in contact sports with women. But they are.
An element of this as well, isn't it? It's the balancing of rights, because when women are saying we want to protect our same-sex spaces because of safety concerns, because of privacy, sometimes because of just purely from embarrassment and wanting to be able to feel comfortable and have those spaces, that doesn't necessarily mean you're saying that trans people, don't have basic human dignity and shouldn't be equal under the law and so on. But in the balancing of rights, why do you think it is that trans and gender ideologies become so elevated to the detriment of women? Because obviously women have started organising more and more around this in the last year or so, and even in the last couple of months. Is that simply because trans activists have been far more active than women's rights activists? And do you think that this has been compared to a new suffragette movement? Do you think that that's the direction that this is going to take?
Okay, so this is, the direction that it's going to take is that women are absolutely standing up and saying, we're part of the conversation. Maybe that's just where we're trying to get to initially, but so how did this get so far so fast? So a huge component of that seems to have been Stonewall, and I would like to, somebody to write the history of this, that Stonewall was a hugely respected organisation that fought for gay rights, and so was present in almost all of our large institutions right across the public sector, across local government, across the banks and the supermarkets. Pretty much all of our major corporations were members of Stonewall. So I think it's about 4 or 5 years ago, Stonewall added the T to the LGB and really started prioritising gender ideology. So you can imagine that if they're in an organisation as a progressive presence, and people are used to respecting them and understanding that they are at the foreground of prioritising people's rights and dignity. So when this comes along and Stonewall is saying, this is what we now need to do, it's like everybody has listened and everybody has thought, okay, this is what we have to do. Now, I think added to that is everybody thought, it's a small number of people. So if there's somebody really in distress with, severe gender dysphoria, I think pretty much all women, and obviously our history is that we've accommodated trans-identifying people. And I think it all still might have been fine, but then we've got this huge social media movement where more and more people are identifying as trans. And I think women are saying, we can't take the numbers. It was absolutely fine to be kind, like in a nightclub, gosh, once or twice a year, there might have been, a man who's a transsexual in the women's toilets, and everybody just gets on, and it's great. But when there's more and more people, we're saying, hang on a second. We need to do a rebalancing here, and we need to consider women's rights. And in the Equality Act, there's other protected characteristics, religion, and religious women are affected by this. Strongly religious Jewish, Muslim, Christian women, they can't go into a space where they think there might be men if they're going to be getting unchanged, swimming, etc. So we need to sort of say all the protected characteristics need to be in a conversation, and all of their rights need to be balanced.
What do you think of so there are some people who've said that the way that women have been, not only the way that women have been erased, but also the way that women are being silenced when they try to object and actually speak up on behalf of their own rights, that there have been some that have said that there is an element of misogyny in that. Would you agree with them?
I absolutely think so. So women have said we want single-sex spaces, and we want to be able to discuss our single-sex spaces. Now, when people have just sort of said, you can't discuss that, that's kind of like, you need to be silent. And there's another thing that comes out always is be kind. So I kind of love the way...
Standing up for your rights is not being
be kind are never kind.
Yeah, no, well, this is what I'm interested in.
It is a simple way, rule of thumb, they're going to be nasty people.
Yeah, so I'm always just amazed by that, because obviously kindness goes both ways. And yet the be kind is to women, you lot must be kind. So effectively they're saying the trans-identifying man, he must be prioritised.
Yeah,
privileging his comfort over
back, women's comfort.
And you must be kind. And so there is a misogyny in that, isn't there? That, you take the hit. Well, we're actually saying, one of our phrases is women are human. We're all equals.
But I have to say though, Caroline, I mean, the one thing that sort of has surprised me is that more women aren't more up in arms about it.
Okay, yeah, I can tell you why that is. It is fear. And it's a great thing, isn't it, that our society, all those isms, people hate to be called racist, they hate to be called sexist, and that's great that we've got that far, but people hate to be called transphobic. It's really been weaponized. So it's just been very, very successful that if you're in a workplace and, a trans-identifying person is using the women's loos,
and people's livelihoods are at stake.
Yeah, a woman is transphobic if she challenges that, and then her livelihood is at stake as well.
You see, this to me is sort of Stalinist.
It's Stalinist, yeah,
right?
I
just
agree.
calling someone transphobic, which is a very strong word.
Even if you look at the people who get cancelled, that actually a vast majority, it seems, of people getting cancelled, fired from their jobs, no platformed, they're what would be described as gender critical feminists. And even I think it actually it suggests how far we've gone in this and how entrenched the ideology has become, that even in Maya Forstater's case, the idea that gender critical beliefs are a protected philosophical belief is itself absurd, because it's not a belief, it's a statement of biological fact. And so even that in some way makes it seem like it is less of itself, if that makes sense.
I know, and my understanding is she had to fight it that way, the way, the Equality Act, etc. is structured, so it had to be structured as a belief.
Because it's the only way that you can fight for it.
And yet, this is why, people like myself have sort of, stepped up to say, our society must defend science, mustn't we? How do we go forward if we sort of start moving away from science? And
that's truly
real.
Stalinist, that scientists like, I can't remember the name of the famous scientist's name, is it Sir Winston? And when he or Lord even, he came out and spoke out against this, that even scientists are being told that they have to deny science, they have to deny statements of biological fact, otherwise they'll be cancelled.
There's another way of looking at this, I'd say, is not to diminish what you're doing, but that I don't even know how sincere, actually, the trans movement is. When I say that, I mean, I think that it's being used, right? Just like the other ones you mentioned, race and what have you. These are things that are being used as a way of undermining and actually sort of trying to destroy our sense of what we are, even. You know, basically, I know that it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just not. But basically, I think a lot of it is in bad faith. I think there's no real hurt. It is a way of somehow fighting a political battle. And if you can demoralize people as much as they currently are, or make them shut up, and you know, there are T-shirts you can get saying "Be quiet." If you can't be this, that, and other, be quiet. I mean, you know, corporate chief execs wear these. There was one in the Sunday Times this weekend wearing this sort of stuff. I think it stings. But I think it is a kind of form of attack going through all of our institutions. You're quite right. No one is going to say, you know, if you say transphobic, what is the comeback from that? What is the, no, I'm not transphobic, but I just feel this, that, and the other. Get it?
So for me, sort of slowly coming into this debate, I felt like the gender critical feminists had absolutely focused on the women's rights angle and protecting women's single sex spaces and sports. And so for me as a conservative, I felt that what wasn't getting enough of an airing was exactly what you're talking about, that actually undermining science. We all know that, you know, there are two sexes. That's how evolution happened. So to be undermining science, it's one of the foundations of our society, and the pursuit of truth. Yeah, so to be sort of running away from truth, free speech. Some people would say the absolute foundation is free speech. And of course, this is the premier issue where you're not allowed free speech. You must not talk about it. You must be quiet and be kind. So when science is undermined, the pursuit of truth is undermined.
Free speech.
Free speech is undermined. It's an attack on our society and how we live.
Yes.
And that's why we all must push back and say enough is enough.
And there are also implications as well for the whole idea of self-ID for free speech. So this is something that's also been in the press this week surrounding the government's decision on conversion therapy to have conversion therapy defined as being for homosexuals, not including trans in that, because when conversion therapy is used to describe something that takes place with trans people, what they're basically saying is conversion therapy is anything other than affirming somebody's self-ID. This has come in the same week as this Conservative MP has come out saying that he's trans, but also isn't going to change his pronouns from he, him. He's continuing to live his life as a man and to be understood as a man, you know, referring to his biological sex. So obviously there have to be some...
Why did he say it then?
It was a very good question.
Why did you say it?
But, you know, this obviously has implications for free speech if there are at least some activists, Stonewall namely, very unhappy that the government has made this decision, because it means that there will be other options open to people who are experiencing gender dysphoria other than just the medical pathway. But even that alone, if somebody says, you know, if I identify as a man, and you tell me, you know, are you sure about that? That would be conversion.
That's conversion therapy and made illegal.
Well, it's the same as sort of, you know, the whole movement of anti-racism. We are going to make this institution an anti-racist. The implication being that it was racist before. And how on earth do you say, I am against this? What, you mean you're racist? It's all about the use of language and basically co-opting, taking over the language. You know, it's the same thing. But the point comes, I mean, I think what you're doing is fantastic, because I think you've hit on something by simply, very clear, these things come down, I think, to something very simple. You want to ask politicians standing at the local elections, presumably in May.
We picked the local elections just because, to get going.
Well, because they'll be on show, won't they?
And they're coming up.
Yeah, you're going to have your work cut out going all around the country. But you've actually come up with something where you say, define a woman. Do you think a woman has a penis, right, or whatever? That clarifies it very, very well. And
you know, the other very simple one is: will you defend women and girls single-sex spaces? Yeah. Because all local authorities, you know, run swimming pools, playgrounds. So the playgrounds will have toilets, and like in planning, like say somebody's, you know, a great big new building is going up. Yeah. New office space, will you ensure that there are single-sex toilets there? So it's absolutely a local authority issue. But Peter, I just want to go back to what you were saying, because we're building up a list of what's under attack. And we said science, free speech, we said something else there as well, and you added language. You know, our language is ours. It's ours to evolve. Yeah. And that's a very democratic thing, isn't it? It's not for anybody to come over the top of us and say, we're changing how you speak. And this is a movement which is trying to say, we're going to tell you how to speak.
Well, yes,
and we just say, no, you can't, nobody tells us how to speak. That evolves democratically.
But the thing is, I think your grassroots movement, you know, you say, oh, well, people can't just come to us and say, we're going to change the way you think and how you say things. We no longer have the luxury of people defending us. That's the point.
Yeah.
The very people who should be making these points in defence of us are just on board with all of this. You know, they're on board with the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, so basically everything has got to be grassroots.
It's absolutely got to be grassroots, and you know, we're defending our way of life.
Yes. I'm very
that sounds
glad
like
that
a
you say
trivial
that.
phrase, doesn't it? But it's literally defending the foundations of our society. Science, reason, free speech, language, and I'll add another one. This is, I can hardly get my head around it, but so this idea that, you know, that we can't really be sure. So the British Library put out an email to its staff saying, you know, you shouldn't just automatically sort of sex somebody, gender them when you first meet them. I mean, so when I saw you earlier today, I was meant to stand back from the integrity of my senses and wait to find out from you whether you were male or female.
That surely has huge implications in that you're actually asking, and I mean, there are safeguarding concerns around this too, because I don't remember how long ago this was. It was probably before the pandemic. There was a sign, I think it was at Oxford University, that was put up on a toilet door that said something like, if you see someone in this toilet that you don't think belongs here, basically shut up, don't say anything. And so if you were saying about, you know, the bigger implications of this for our culture and so on, if you're telling people to deny what they believe to be true, to say things that they believe to be untrue, and to simply as a sort of almost as an automatic reflex, to instinctively step back from your own perception of things, your own understanding of a situation, you are putting people in danger in the bigger sense. Never mind in the more narrow, restricted sense of allowing men into women's spaces, and particularly spaces where there may be vulnerable women. But on the broader sense, this is surely a danger for the whole of society.
Okay, so at two levels. The one of just step back from your from your senses. So that's challenging our very kind of reasoning, you know, our linkage with our senses and how we quickly think.
It's abusive, it's almost gaslighting.
It's abuse, so it's abusive. But then to sort of the broader safeguarding.
But this has been going on, I would say, for a very long time, in all sorts of different guises. For example, take immigration, right? Take the issue of immigration. Basically, now, what happened was that the narrative became pushed by governments, cultural establishment, the lot, that Britain was a nation of immigrants, right? This is simply untrue, right? It's simply untrue. It was not. In fact, we had remarkably little for years and years and years. Whatever you think about immigration, but the idea was to somehow take away from people the ability to argue their point about that. And also by putting huge sanctions and saying, you know, this, what are you saying? You're out. This isn't a good thing, that diversity isn't strength. So, you know, actually there's not a jot or scintilla of evidence saying that diversity is strength, right? But somehow we still keep saying it, don't we? And you wouldn't not say it. And that's a triumph of kind of the takeover in a way of language. I think that those are political issues. What's particularly fundamental about this is it's our very nature of how we define what we are.
By the way, so I haven't brought in,
like,
we've built up our list of what's under attack, and honestly, our sexuality, I mean, all of us are either, you know, heterosexually attracted, same-sex attracted. You know, I think a small number of people are bisexual. But this movement again tries to gaslight us about our sexuality, and very particular gay people.
And tells gay people that they're
Yeah.
transphobic if
Yeah.
they don't fancy someone who
Yes, if
is
they don't-
identifying
exactly.
as that
Yes,
gender. But
exactly.
did you see, so speaking of the denial of reality, there was a tweet a couple of weeks ago, a trans person tweeted saying that they were experiencing their first period cramps as a trans woman.
Oh, gosh.
And women see that and know that somebody who's transitioned from being male to female and identifies as a woman is not experiencing the same things that a woman experiences. They cannot experience the same things that a woman experiences. They can't get pregnant. They can't have periods, full stop. So whatever that person is experiencing or believes they're experiencing or is saying they're experiencing, if a woman says, no, sorry, that is not the same thing, she is faced with a choice between denying reality or being accused of being a transphobe. So actually, at the very, very core of it, describing this as abusive and gaslighting, it's telling women that not only is it trying to erase women, but telling women, no, your experience of yourself is wrong, and you're not allowed to express your experience. And surely, never mind misogyny, surely that is, I would have never identified myself publicly in any way as being a feminist, or possibly even privately, but that surely is the most anti-feminist thing that you could ever do to a woman.
I mean, look, it's just absolute gaslighting of us and our sense of reality, and that's why we've come together and across political parties to say enough is enough. We're pushing back now. We're reclaiming our language. We're reclaiming our right to speak. And we don't have the answers yet. Of course, there's all kinds of areas where we can debate, but I just want to say all the characteristics are protected. So we want to talk with trans-identifying people, but say we're in this debate as well. And our rights matter.
You've been, sort of writing and active for quite a long time, obviously, Caroline. But I mean, you're probably going to have to get ready for people to really start being abusive and things like that. Maybe they haven't already. I mean, maybe they've already been rough to you. But I think that such is the level of hatred and anger. Yeah. This idea that somehow, this be kind thing, this idea that somehow we are on the side of the angels. No, you're not actually. You just dislike. You dislike, you hate, you resent. Those are the emotions that I feel come from these people all the time.
So before we move on to the Hungarian elections, it's not really a lighter note, but let's dip into this story anyway. So another story that came out this week was the decision by Stirling University to drop Jane Austen from their curriculum in order to decolonise it.
Stirling, was it in Stirling?
And they have dropped it in favour of works by an African-American author called Toni Morrison, who I have to admit I've never actually heard of, and their special authors module for 2022, it says here, includes Black postmodernism, Gothic, as well as the aesthetics of the contemporary US and the African-American novel. So the reason why I raise this in this context before going on to the Hungarian elections is because what struck me about this that I also thought was interesting is that for a long time people spoke about, the oppression of women throughout history, and many people would have said that it was important to have more female writers from British history in the curriculum, and Jane Austen is one of the premier British female authors, and is not only of significance to the UK but around the world. She's something that we have given to the world. So it struck me as a particularly mad one that she would be dropped in favour of an African-American African-American author, because not only is that from outside of the UK, but also it's basically a decision to drop a female author. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
No, I think, look, I mean, how many times have we talked about cases like this on these programmes? I mean, and you say this seems like a particularly bad one. I've always thought Jane Austen had it coming, actually. I mean, mainly because, yes, what was it that Woody Allen said? What's a post-feminist? Yeah, the sort of women who think the Sabine women had it coming. I always thought she was right for this because, the novels are about people in beautiful houses that were around about the time of the absolute height of the British Empire. Most of them would have been, They could be portrayed as having been exploitative, all of this sort of thing. So I think that, for example, Jane Austen, I think she was even possibly going to come off the money at some point as well, off the currency. Yeah. But this happened. I think so this is just in line with, what all these people are doing. I think what you will find is that the BBC and these kind of people who do period dramas will be very worried about maybe doing adaptations unless they seriously change them. I think this will go. It's like a domino. So, like we have Bridgerton on Netflix, which has this vision of a multicultural Regency London, which is just simply just fantasy. It's absolute fantasy. In fact, it's not doing ethnic minorities any good, really, because if you're saying, well, this is always the case, people walking along, mixed marriages walking along Pall Mall. It's a denial of their history too. You can, yes, exactly. And say, well, what are you complaining about then? That's what people would say. So I think it's a bit of a hostage to fortune, that one.
And wasn't there also an architect who said that that Regency buildings were themselves white supremacist or something to that effect?
I've always thought
they were always going to come from Regency anyway, just because it's something that is beautiful and it's something from that period of history where everything has to be cancelled.
I think the idea, like for example, we were very involved in the statues thing, right, and Save Our Statues. The obvious next target, I've always thought, will be buildings. It will be buildings. Why shouldn't it be? They're going through all these things. The thing is, with this sort of Jane Austen being cancelled, we can sit here and huff and puff and get so angry, but still it happens. Still it happens because the people doing it are the ones who have the power. In this case, university authorities.
Would you see this as being, this particular case or cases like it as also being essentially an erasure of British women's history?
Well, I think, yes, you could say that. But it's obviously part of the much wider movement as well. You know what? Bringing it back to my issue. So things like this, I guess I slightly let it go over my head when I've got with me here, this is an LGBTQIA plus early years magazine. So it's targeted at 2 to 5 year olds. So people are producing this to be taken into our schools, 2 to 5 year olds. I'll just read this out for people. As educators, we have a responsibility to ensure that our students feel included in our pedagogy. So it becomes necessary to consider new strategies that don't put the responsibility of changing gender dynamics on trans children. One example is normalising not assuming pronouns.
How old are these? They're talking about kids of how old?
2 to 5.
This has surely got to be extremely confusing for children who are in a period of time where their imaginations are so malleable, they basically have magical thinking. If you told them that they could become a cow, then they would believe you.
Yeah. So, sorry, just to sort of, because this is related to Jane Austen, when you've got people producing stuff for our schools, targeted at 2 to 5 year olds and trying to say to those little kids not to assume other people's sex. It's such a transgression on the integrity of young children and growing into being able to know who they are and trust their senses and trust adults. And so that's why I've kind of left the wider debate behind about Jane Austen. It's kind of like, psh,
going back to what we've
got
thing.
so
it's all
bad.
Part of the same assault.
I agree,
going back to what we were saying about safety and the bigger picture, teaching that to children is teaching them to not trust their own senses, which surely puts them in extreme danger.
Yes.
Particularly if they are being told that, for the sake of affirmation, for example, that if all of the adults around you and all of the authority figures tell you something that goes against your judgment and your perceptions, then you ought to trust them and you ought to go against what you believe to be right. That has surely got to be extremely dangerous.
I absolutely agree, it's dangerous. Another piece that I had was a Stonewall piece where, again, showing school children, and it was clearly a man in the women's loos. He had long hair, etc. And the children were meant to discuss it, and the result of the little workshop was meant to be how they should all understand that he had the right to be there and that, the girls, the schoolgirls, should be kind and back off. Now, that's absolutely a safeguarding disaster. To tell girls your immediate reaction when you are alone in a single-sex, what should be a safe space for women with a man, is to step back and be kind, is dangerous.
Well, what happens to teachers, and I don't hear much about this, who say, enough with this, I'm not teaching this? Where are they? Where are these people?
Okay, I think there's a movement now, really big push from people like myself and all the campaign groups to say to the Department for Education, you can't back away from this. Yeah. You've got to really step up.
Okay.
So before we move on to the Hungarian elections, I just want to ask...
This is becoming a bit of a kind of a totem.
Sorry.
Before we move on.
We may never get
move
there.
on.
The Hungarian election is like some kind of metaphor for something.
Yeah, I just want to ask briefly, do you think that this is a misrepresentation of the Equality Act or a misunderstanding of the Equality Act on behalf of teachers and people in these institutions?
Okay, so groups like Stonewall have misrepresented the Equalities Act. They have said there's all kinds of guidance which says trans identifying people must be allowed into the toilets or whatever that match their gender identity. And that isn't right. The Equality Act is absolutely clear that women have a right to single-sex spaces. It's a little bit weak in the sense that it's up to the organisations to invoke that right. And so the EHRC, Equalities and Human Rights Commission, has just come out with new guidance affirming that organisations have the right and the responsibility to look at it and all the different protected characteristics coming into play, and where they need to reassert women's right to single-sex spaces. So that's a victory, as you have said, for all the grassroots campaigning. And that's what we all need to do across all of these issues.
That's a very good note to leave that topic on, and let's move on to the Hungarian elections.
Well, no, but there is a connection here. If I can make one, actually, is that because we've just been in Hungary, we made a documentary which, people haven't watched, I do hope they watch, but a lot of them have got about 60,000 views for it so far. But this is a huge part of the appeal of the Fidesz party, which means faith, and Viktor Orban, and that is that basically the Hungarians have a real suspicion of big ideological plans and ideas. First of all, they just have that because of their experience of communism and everything. But also, there's a desire amongst most people, apparently, there, because he's just won a fourth landslide victory, also not to go the way of the West on these issues. So, for which he is hugely demonised, which I think is probably what you were going to ask me. Hugely demonised, has been long before the Ukraine war, long before that. Every time he's elected, because he's they're kind of going against the general run of the way the West is going now, on immigration, on families. So, for example, again on the family issue, they want to maintain the traditional family. The demographics of Hungary, like everywhere in Europe, are going way down. So they wanted to sort of incentivize the family. The more children you have, the better tax situation you have. I'm putting it very crudely, but that's it, without going into the technical sides of it. But also, the other point as well is that whereas we have said in the West, we've got a terrible declining population birth rate, we need more immigrants, they're sort of saying, no, that's not the way to go. If we want to keep the country recognised to be Hungary, then basically we should get Hungarians to have bigger families and all of that. That's basically the thrust. And that's why he's so hated, obviously, by the sort of people that actually we've fighting against now.
Do you think that one of the reasons for the I suppose you would say the criticisms of, or the resentment of, Hungary and the situation in Hungary is that in many ways the tables are turned. So I think it was in the documentary you described, or someone described Orban as being an institutional conservative. And he's been very successful over the last 12 years in building up all of these different institutions and imbuing them with a conservative ethos, in the same way that you would say many organisations in the UK have been imbued with a woke ethos, and through lobby groups like Stonewall being so influential in those institutions. Do you think that part of the reason why that there's so much criticism of Hungary from particularly EU countries is because the tables are turned in that respect, and what we see in Hungary is almost an inverse of the situation in our own countries?
Yes, exactly. I mean, and also pretty much on its own in that sense. I mean, I found when I was there, I think I said this in the film, that it was actually remarkably open-minded. I mean, the whole thrust of it here, and the coverage here, not just from the Guardian and the left, but also the Telegraph excelled itself this week on Orban, is that somehow it is this dictatorship, that freedom of speech is... No, I mean, I think that this is a basic, it's almost an anger that they've taken a different route, and interestingly, one of your great heroes, Roger Scruton, is hugely influential. That's where I got this bust, folks. This is like, we got this from the Scruton Cafe. They have something in Budapest, in this college, but also in the town centre, city centre, called Scruton Cafe. Really nice place actually to go, just to go, very nice. Dedicated to his memory. And they gave him the medal, they gave him a very big medal, Orban gave him a medal before he died. And so they're very, very aware of him. Can you imagine a Roger Scruton Cafe in downtown Bloomsbury here? Can you imagine it? It'd be burnt down.
What do you think, though, of, because obviously there are some things that I think rightly Hungary and Orban should be praised for, and things that conservatives in the West admire the Hungarians for standing up for their own culture and their distinctiveness and so on. But there are a lot of criticisms that I think need a response. So, for example, Orban's propensity to be very, very pro-Putin, particularly under the current circumstances, their hesitancy to sanction Putin over what's happening in Ukraine, and a number of accusations along those lines. As you mentioned, also the fact that there are some who would accuse him of being, or of eroding democracy and of not being a friend of the West. How would you respond to those criticisms?
I think that the impression I got was they walk a kind of tightrope, right? So they're in NATO, and they very much celebrate that and everything, but then at the same time they kind of, there's this very much this sort of "we are Hungary alone." So basically, I think a lot of the message of his election campaign was, "I'm not, we are going to stay out of this," and all of that. Having said that, they've taken in nearly 400,000 refugees. I think it's the third biggest amount taken in. So that rather gives a lie, for example, to the idea that they are racist and anti-immigrant. I mean, because these people coming, obviously they have a border with the Ukraine, and there's a big Hungarian ethnic grouping in the Ukraine too. But they sort of manage very carefully to ride two horses. That's all I can say. But even if Ukraine weren't happening, because when we started making the documentary, it wasn't. I mean, we were going to Hungary anyway. We sort of knew, if he wins this again, there will be hell to pay from the usual suspects. And sure enough, there has been, really.
Do you think another one of the aspects of Orban's success has been helping to somehow possibly stay or improve on Hungary's demographic decline, in a way that the rest of Europe's demographics are declining quite rapidly, and Hungary's approach has been to focus on building families and reproducing, rather than filling those demographic gaps by bringing in migrants. So that's obviously one aspect of his success. Do you think that you know, obviously in that respect, having another term and possibly a term after that will go some way to helping them reach their target. I think it's 2030 they wanted to go.
It takes a long time, I think.
So my question is, do you think that another Orban term, or should I say, what do you think another term of Orban's premiership in Hungary?
Another one, you mean after this?
This one, possibly another. What implications do you think that will have for Europe overall, and if that's going to have any implications, particularly on, you know, obviously Orban is very much pro-family and against a lot of this ideology coming out of. Yeah,
no, I mean, without question. I would say it's a very interesting point, right? Because it's quite a long-term thing. I would say that essentially with the demographic point, the point was made to us, you know, they've had some success with this. This takes a long time. It's a generational thing. So you probably need another 2 terms or something to see anything sort of really changing. I think that the demonisation of him probably will intensify, because the whole line we have is that we need migrants because we're shrinking. That's why. So if you have someone who says absolutely no, you can do it the other way, they're not, you know, they're going to probably demonise even further. I think one of the most interesting developments there is this thing which we will be talking about on the channel in future, called MCC, which is a college, the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, very much patronised by Sir Roger Scruton, but essentially it is a college which is for younger people who are already at university. It's like a conservative sort of hub, and they're trying to build a conservative-leaning elite for the future, for all the institutions. That's a long-term thing. Of course, everyone here at the left here will say, oh, it's just brainwashing, like they don't do that, you know, themselves, which of course they do. That, I think, is a very interesting institution.
How did, I mean, obviously Orban has had a big influence on this, but how Hungary is so anomalous amongst the other European countries in how successful they've been at building conservative institutions. How did they do that? How did they go about doing that? Where did it start? How long did it take?
The MCC college has been around since the 1990s. I think the ground was already kind of quite well prepared, because of course, you know, they've been sort of colonized by God knows how many people over 500 years, and the last being the Soviets. There is such a resistance to having to take on anything that looks like an absurd ideology. They will not have it. They will not do it. You know. So there is the nature, maybe, of the people to begin with. Also, a very sort of slightly besieged mentality. They have a language. You know, it doesn't relate to anyone around. All of that kind of thing. But I think that it obviously is showing success. In the sense that with the college, the MCC college, you know, you need young people to go to that, right? And they have been going in their thousands, and so it's doing, I suppose, what it sets out to, which is looking at the future and saying we need a new kind of elite, or rather conservative elite. So I think that it's partly Orban's doing, because let's face it, he's been there since 2010, but it's also in the nature of the people. I think they're it's a rural country, you know, it's quite conservative anyway. But you've got this little country which in some ways has just become a bit of an intellectual sort of magnet in a way. Yeah.
I think on that note, we're going to have to actually wrap things up. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
And please do like and subscribe below, and we will see you next time on Newspeak.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.